From Another Angle, a Carnegie Council podcast. I'm Hilary Sutcliffe, and I'm on the board of the Carnegie Council for AI and Equality. In this series, I get to talk to some of today's most innovative thinkers who take familiar concepts like technology, democracy, and human nature and show them to us from a quite different angle. And what really excites me about these conversations is the way they challenge our fundamental assumptions. And certainly for me, and I hope for you too, their fresh thinking makes me see the world in a new way and opens up a whole raft of possibilities and ways of looking at the future. Now, today, we're looking at technological progress from another angle. Now, I don't know about you, but I hear a lot about how technology innovation is going to increase our productivity, make our lives easier, create lots of new jobs, replace the old ones, which just lost as a normal byproduct of progress and growth. But at the same time, I see much more clearly, it seems, the greater inequality, the more badly paid gig economy jobs, exploited workers, and not much sign of this prosperity that we've been promised. But very fortunately, my guest today has spent many years researching and observing this phenomenon of technology progress and can shed some light on whether this is just my imagination or it's a reality. So I'm delighted to welcome Professor Simon Johnson, an economist at MIT and co-author with colleague Daron Acemoglu of a new book, Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. Welcome, Professor Johnson.
Thanks for having me.
So my question here about technology progress is very focused on the here and now and about how this time it's all going to be different. But what's so fascinating about your book is it steps out of that. And this book promises and delivers an astonishing 1,000-year overview of the history of technology and progress. And a clear picture, it seems to emerge, of the dynamics of innovation. So, and this is a bit of a big ask, but could you take us through on a sort of helicopter view of these last 1,000 years and the conclusions that you've reached?
Yes, absolutely. So I think the last 1,000 years, Hilary, are characterized by a couple of repeated elements, if you like. One of them is that for most of this 1,000 years in Western society, so the societies that grew out of Western Europe, we have been innovating. We're always been innovative, even in some of the darker periods of our history. Now, if you go back 10,000 years, I think you could make the argument that many societies have also been innovative. Some of them ran into brick walls, which we might discuss. But these Western societies became, for various reasons, creative, innovative. There was a lot of bubbling up of ideas. But the problem, Hilary, that for a long time was that that creativity, that innovation did not become shared prosperity. So in the Dark Ages, for example, lots of new ideas, lots of changes of agriculture, lots of improvements in commerce. But what did the ordinary people get out of it? Nothing much in terms of living standards. However, a number of very big cathedrals were built off the money that the elite got from the improved agricultural productivity. That didn't do very much for the material well-being of ordinary people. What changed actually only in the late 19th century is that this innovativeness, this creativity, even the first 100 years, the Industrial Revolution delivered very little for ordinary people. But after the 1850s, those benefits become shared much more broadly. And if you look back, if we'd written this book in 1980, I think Hilary would have said, problem solved. We figured out how to turn an innovative culture into shared prosperity. That would have been in the view in 1980. But unfortunately, today, almost 25 years later, or almost 45 years later, we have to say, oops, we seem to have receded. We're still creative, we're still innovative, we're still coming up with new products, but the shared prosperity piece has slipped away from us again. And so the question is, how do we get back on that track, on that 100-year period where things really work much better for most people? Can we get back there? Is there something inherent in modern technology that makes it harder or maybe easier to get back? Those are the questions we deal with in the book.
I was really intrigued that you also dig very deeply into particular examples that I think really shed some light onto that question of how do we learn from the past today. Do you want to take us through a couple of your favorites?
Well, my absolute favorite, Hilary, of all time is Edwin Chadwick and the creation of modern sanitation, because everyone's forgotten this. And it's absolutely crucial to how the standard of living turned around in the 19th century, how health conditions were improved. And it actually made it possible for us to live in very concentrated numbers in large cities, which are also, in many cases, hubs of creativity. Without killing each other through infectious disease. So in the mid 19th century, as you know, and I'm sure many of your listeners know, health conditions in places like London were absolutely awful. There were many people living together in crowded conditions, and the toilet situation was awful. In London, it was even worse in Manchester, Sunderland, these brand new industrial cities. And along came this chap, Edwin Chadwick, who was actually a Benthamite. And the Benthamites, as you also know, Hilary, were very focused on a utilitarian view, very focused on what was efficient. They were not really very strong in empathy. I think it's fair to say that. But Chadwick said, look, why are all these poor people dying? Why are they not showing up for work? Because of this infectious disease. What's the root of that disease? Well, it's the fact that the sanitation is awful. Let's take existing technology, recombine it, and have water flow into people's homes on a continual basis, and use that same water to flush out the human waste and dispose of that safely in processing plants away from where everybody's living. Now, it sounds sort of straightforward when you say it, and maybe a bit obvious to modern people, but it was absolutely not obvious. It was immensely controversial. It required, of course, substantial investments, including from the public sector, Hilary, right? So it's public-private partnerships throughout this. And it transformed how we live in Western cities and how people live. Many people, sadly, not everybody has access to this around the world today, but it transformed how we live. And it was absolutely technology focused on improving people's lives. We can call it social progress. I mean, the Benthamites were not big on social progress for the sake of it. They were big on, let's have more people work productively, let's have more efficient processes. Fine, okay, well, we turns out we can actually bring those themes together and deliver on something that has changed the world.
I think very interesting as well with the Industrial Revolution. I often get talked of perhaps as a Luddite, and we hear a lot about the Luddites at the moment. And I was wondering, the Luddites then were saying a lot of what, those of us who are questioning the trajectory of certain types of innovation and the lack of focus on social progress and individual empowerment are saying now. You have an interesting whole area about the Industrial Revolution and the Luddites. Just give us a bit more on that.
Well, there were several episodes of the so-called Luddites at machine breaking. I think the one that is most important as a reference point for today is the one that happened in the early 1810s. And it was specifically focused, the anger there was against the power loom, which was being used for weaving. So what had happened was that spinning became industrialized and mechanized in the 18th century, in the 1700s. Spinning for cotton in particular, cotton was very well suited to these the machinery that developed, and cotton created a fabric that was very appealing, somewhat extent to British people, but very much to people who lived in warmer climates. So it became a big industry to import cotton from India, spin it in Manchester, and export, and then turn that yarn into cloth and export the cloth around the world. Now, that process of weaving was done on hand looms. So they were machines, but they were very simple machines. They were in people's houses. There was a system of outsourcing, basically, or outwork, as it was called. So there were merchants who coordinated this, but it was done in people's houses, and that was done by people, often men, who were quite skilled. This probably started as a part-time job in many parts of Lancashire, for example, but by the early 1800s, it was a full-time job. Now, along comes the power loom, Hilary, and that takes the work away from the hand loom workers. So these are skilled people. They've built up a trade. Between 1780 and 1800, they made a lot of money. It was known as the golden age of weaving, and all of a sudden they're wiped out. And the key question in all these episodes of automation, Hilary, is what new jobs are you creating, right? So some of the jobs, the existing tasks are going to the big machines. They're now in the factories. They're going to be, those factory machines are going to be tended by children. So child labor is on the big rise here, and women who have obviously always worked very hard, but now they're been working very hard in these factory conditions. Some men are going to have jobs as overseers in those factories, but a lot of men have now lost the opportunities. There's no unemployment insurance. It's very hard to move out of Lancashire. Their incomes go down a long way, and they are extremely angry because what's the new tasks? What else can they do? Where can they go to work? And the answer is nowhere. So the number of handloom weavers remains very high. It was about 250,000 at the beginning of the 1800s, and it was still about 250,000 by 1830, but their incomes dropped like a stone, Hilary. So of course they're angry. They're looking, these men wanted to work. They wanted to be productive. Okay, so stopping the machines, the hand looms, stopping the power looms didn't work out. But it's always the case in all of these episodes that people are looking for what's new. And you need a system, a process that's generating new tasks, and particularly new tasks that require skills. That's when you get better paid jobs. And that was absolutely missing in the early 1800s, 1810s, missing still in the 1820s. It's only with the coming of the railway age after about 1830 that the broader economy begins to turn around.
So that was what was, I think, depressing and intriguing about your book. It's actually how technology really did take jobs without replacing them with new jobs. And until, as you said, there are 2 or 3 pockets of hope at different times. So tell us a bit more about what were the conditions, what was the context that actually made some areas actually more progressive for more people and some not.
Well, a number of things start to go right in the second half of the 19th century. The first one that I would emphasize is the railway age. So railways reduce transportation costs. People can move around. They can see what's happening in other places. And it generates a lot of jobs. And many of those jobs were quite well paid because there's responsibility that comes with being a signalman, for example, on the railway. So that's the railways, a big boost. The second is actually the arrival of the Americans on the scene as an industrial power. So in 1851, the Great Exhibition in London, the Americans had 2 things on basically on exhibit: guns and some stuffed animals that they'd shot with the guns. That was it, 1851. By 1890, the United States is the leading industrial power in the world. How did they do that? It was not using skilled labor. Skilled artisans tended to stay behind in Europe. What the Americans had was a lot of unskilled labor. And what they did in their industrialization was find ways to make those unskilled workers more productive, give them skills, on-the-job training, I suppose we'd call it now. They became skilled, they became better paid, and we're going to combine that with the third element, which is stronger political rights for workers. Now, don't want to exaggerate how quickly democratization came to Britain or to the United States, actually, but between 1850 and 1910, there is a rise of real equality in terms of voting rights. There is a rise of trade unions. There are also conflicts about trade unions, and there are also, of course, there's a rise of women's rights. If you combine these elements, you're getting more pressure for higher wages, better working conditions, and also better living conditions. And you're combining that with better industrial technology, higher productivity. That combination is what delivers higher wages and better standard of living. And that becomes the basis for the shared prosperity that subsequently, with some bumps in the road, really delivers during the 20th century.
So let's zoom into today. So that concept that you talked about, that you map across the 1,000 years, that sort of success model, if you like. Can you just talk us through how you feel that has and hasn't worked over the last, let's say, 30, 40 years?
Right. So a couple of things have gone wrong with this model. And just to also set the stage very clearly, the 1956 and 70s were very good for shared prosperity in most industrial societies. So Western Europe, North America, and of course, Japan gets in on the act also. So you got the shared prosperity. But then what happens in the 1980s is a shift, I think, in the ideology of business. It becomes quite a bit harsher and anti-worker, I think might be fair to say, certainly not pro-worker. Second is we have this digital transformation. So the digital technology arrives and automation comes into factories. That pushes out people who are middle paid, middle skilled. But it doesn't create new opportunities for people with those skills. What it does is it pushes them down into the lower skilled jobs where they're competing with people who don't have much skill to start with. And that depresses wages. So this is a big part of the widening wage inequality that we've seen. And of course, you're going to layer on top of that globalization, so increasing trade and competition from lower wage countries. Remember that globalization, Hilary, is made possible by big improvements in technology, including telecommunications, transportation. And linked by all that digital technology. So we've got technology driving directly wage inequality and facilitating the globalization, and that's those are the big drivers of that widening income inequality and the decline, basically, or the disruption, and some people would say the death of the shared prosperity model in the European tradition.
You talked to us about how there was a deliberate, conscious aspect to creating shared prosperity than basically making the rich richer, as we found out throughout history. In terms of now, I think you've said, we've got 60s and 70s, we've seen something. We're looking at the very present day and the really high-tech digital economy that we've got now. And in my work, I hear quite a lot about how we need to deliberately create technology for social progress. We need to deliberately create technology to empower people. And yet, so back to my early question, are we seeing that? Are we not seeing it? Or are we seeing a little bit of both?
I think that's a very good framing, Hilary. I think that is the top, I would say, policy priority when it comes to technology, and technology drives pretty much everything in our societies. And I think the key point here is there always are alternative paths for technology. So you can make choices, you can go more in one direction, you can go more in another direction. That's the right framing. Now, to answer your question directly, I think where we are currently is very heavily weighted towards the automation first, bring in the machines and the algorithms to replace workers, let everybody else, let the chips fall where they may from that. I think that's very dangerous. That's a continuation of this digital divide that came out of the 1980s. And it doesn't have to be that way, Hilary. There's a lot of other innovations that could be pursued, what we call human complementary. Now, all technology is complementary to some humans, but what we mean by human complementary is it boosts the productivity of people who have middle skills. So people like electricians, people like nurses, people like teachers, people who are not intense technology specialists, don't have a PhD in engineering. These middle-paid, middle-skilled people can become a lot more productive using generative AI and its cousins and what comes next. But that's not the current focus. The current focus, which is dominated by a few big tech companies and dominated still by the version of capitalism that emerged from the 1980s, that path of technology, I think, is going to be pretty damaging to other people.
Yes, I mean, it's peculiar. I sort of think about and write about sometimes this slightly weird moment that we're in, where we're trying to make machines more like people. So we're surveilling people, Amazon workers, you have to work like a machine. You're actually being made into a machine almost. And then we're trying to make machines more like people. So we're trying to get generative AI to be a person. And it sort of seems to be happening separately. Whereas like machines, technology, digital technologies, in fact, all technologies, I get involved in a few of the others as well, really should be there to enhance the power and capacity of people. How have we got into this really weird polarized land that doesn't actually see that the human as perhaps the sort of the center that needs to be supported, helped and empowered, and yet we see the machine at the center?
Well, let me give two answers to that, Hilary, both of which are rooted in history. One is some things we've forgotten, and the other is some things we remember far too well. So the things we've forgotten is what happened in the big transformation in the early 20th century, the arrival of the assembly line. Now, Henry Ford was a big driver of this. Henry Ford was a difficult character. I'm not endorsing his personal views in any way, but if you look at what Henry Ford did, he put car production onto the assembly line, and then he brought electricity to the assembly line. When Ford started with car production in Detroit, early 1900s, there were about 40,000 people working in that industry. They were producing about the same number of cars. It was artisanal work. And Ford automated a lot of those tasks. However, when he did that, he and all the people around him, when they put those tasks onto the assembly line, they also created a lot of new tasks. And those new tasks employed, by the end of the 1920s, 400,000 people. So you've got 10 times as many people working. You've moved routine tasks onto that assembly line, but you've created a lot of tasks that require human judgment, discretion, communication. Those are the new tasks. They require skill. They're quite well paid. And car production, of course, has gone up from that 40 or 50,000 level to about 3 million cars at the end of the 1920s in the United States. So automation, to get the benefits of automation, it needs to be combined with a processor system that generates new tasks. Those new tasks have to require and help people develop skill. That's the magic place. And I think we've completed that. So answer one is we've completely forgotten that, Hilary.
So interesting. Do you feel Henry Ford had a sort of pro-society approach in mind with this, or was actually just a lucky accident for him?
So Henry Ford worked with Thomas Edison. And Edison, of course, was this genius inventor who imagined what electricity, he didn't invent electricity or didn't discover electricity, but he did imagine what you could do with electricity. And he did bang away at trying to improve things like the light bulb until he actually, made a lot of progress. And I think Henry Ford represented exactly and embodied and absorbed exactly that kind of mentality. And I think that the dynamic of that situation, the availability of human talent, and the competitive nature of that, of the industry they were in, encouraged the creation of these new tasks. It encouraged, a lot of upstream work, materials going to cars, a lot of downstream work, how you sell the cars, how you maintain the cars, and of course that led to some other things like the development of suburbs. So hard to say exactly, Hilary, and I don't want to idolize one individual, but I'm saying that even Ford and Ford's version of capitalism was not as anti-worker, nowhere near as anti-worker as what came after the 1980s. That's also important. Ford was a bit paternalistic. Some of that's controversial. I'm not recommending that also either. But he was not trying to drive the workers down and drive wages down all the time. He was actually trying to pay many instances higher wages to retain workers and reduce labor turnover, which is a good way to get share prosperity.
The car industry is an intriguing case study, isn't it? I've been just looking recently at a tiny little company that it's called River Simple. It's a hydrogen car, and they wanted to rethink the business model of cars, which has become, that doesn't have this model anymore. And they had themselves a sort of a council which included future generations. And what they basically did, just very briefly, is they reinvented the business model of cars. And one of the things they did, they invented how it was made so that you didn't have to have this big, large, factories in these huge places that take over the whole of one whole city. The way that they designed these cars was actually enable people to have them in small cities, so that you could actually empower different types of industries, different types of jobs in a smaller place. And they even started to look at how the business model of cars is really all about, we sell it really cheap and then we make the money out of your servicing and your parts, that actually they're leasing the parts. So actually it's in the business interest of all of those component manufacturers and the car themselves to actually make them last longer. So I'm looking also at innovative business models that actually deliberately make those attempts, whilst at the same time wanting to make loads of money, wanting to sell loads of cars, and wanting to do that. Do you have any other people that you've seen, or do you have any other industries or organizations that you've seen that really are looking to disrupt these sorts of business models?
Well, I work at MIT, and at MIT we have a lot of people who are very much looking for new ideas and disruptions on the technology side, and I think many of those, would have implications for business, including more modular approaches to production, as you're saying. There's a lot of discussion around additive manufacturing and what that could do. There's a lot of discussion around the future of biotech and the future of pharmaceutical production, which could be done in very different ways. So yes, I think pushing on business models is important. Of course, mass production by itself is not necessarily the problem, Hilary. It can be, and you can have some problematic business models. I'm not supportive of the car industry by any means, but just producing things at scale and very efficiently is not the problem if you combine that with creating new opportunity and new tasks, right? It's the two legs. You've got to walk on both legs. If you just focus on automation, you just say, right, we're going to automate everything in our grocery store, supermarket. You're not going to need anybody to check out anymore. Well, where do those people go? What are the jobs that are being created? What's how does the system absorb that labor? I think what we've seen so far with self-checkout kiosks in supermarkets has not been very encouraging, because what you do there is you basically transfer the work onto the customer who's not paid. The customer experience doesn't particularly improve depending on the particular implementation, and you don't raise the wages of the people who stay behind in the supermarket. What you do is you change the balance of power between management and labor. So the workers who remain are quite afraid of losing their jobs because it gets easier to replace them. So I think that there's a lot of reasons to worry about how technology change is imagined and deployed and implemented in the modern world, and what people are going to do with generative AI. Key point, though, Hilary, is it doesn't have to be that way. There's other much more human-centric paths that we could choose for technology. They're just not the ones that are being driven by the people who've taken control over the vision for the future of technology at the moment.
That's a great segue to your final chapters. And what I really liked about your book, a lot of academics were very good at problem framing with not necessarily practical real world ideas about how it could be better. So talk to us about the sort of three concepts that you have in mind that how technology could be deployed better for a sort of more pro-society, a more human-centric approach.
Yeah, so I think the three things that we emphasize are, first of all, change the narrative. So that's what we're doing in this podcast, right? We're saying, look, it doesn't have to be the way that any particular tech guru or billionaire says it has to be. There's lots of choice here, and society can shape technology. Edwin Chadwick, as I said, my favorite example. The second point is you need to have some countervailing power. So what emerged in the late 19th century, and everybody who lives in Britain knows this, was the rise of political rights for more people, the spread of the franchise, and the rise of trade unions. So those countervailing powers pushing for higher wages, super important. Now, we don't have strong trade unions in many industrial countries today, so we've lost that countervailing power. Where are you going to get it? What are the voices? What are the pressures for safeguards on surveillance, for example, for limiting how much monitoring there is of workers, or making sure that's that's done in an appropriate manner, a manner that makes them safer, not a manner that exploits them more. That articulation or that the organization there is somewhat missing, Hilary. But that's an ongoing discussion also. And I think the third piece is to have more visionary proposals and really push people to say, right, what do you want technology to do? What is it that we're missing? And I always say to people, let's focus on the problem to be solved, not what the technology, not what you think the technology can already do. What is the problem? What is it that you would like to do with generative AI, for example? And then let's work on that and figure out why that's happening or not happening, or how to catalyze that from the government or whatever. And I think that's a conversation which everyone can participate in, Hilary. I don't think you need a PhD in anything or even a degree in anything to say, right, I've got this problem. This is why it's not happening. How can we bring technology to bear to help? I disagree with Bill Gates on key point. Bill Gates says that he's never met a problem that he can't solve with technology. I'm not somebody who thinks that technology is a magic bullet, but I do think technology combined with policies and social pressures can be really helpful. And I do think that's a better way to focus your technology development. And Bill Gates, to his credit, has done some of that, for example, on vaccine development.
Yes, I mean, I like to think of it, if you use the word innovation instead of technology, and innovation is about ideas, things, and ways of doing things, then you can broaden out. One of the things for me is that technologies become only to mean digital technology, really, or science-based technology, whereas innovation can mean all sorts of things. And some of the new ideas that you're talking about in your book are innovations that need more attention drawn to them. I get wheeled out now. I started doing this work in the 90s when it was about responsible business, and then in the early 2000s when it was nanotechnology and it was biotech and AI and robotics and quantum tech and neurotech, and I just get wheeled out, every 5 years to the next new tech to have this: what problem are you trying to solve with your technology conversation? And honestly, the answers I get are technological progress, this great science, this great tech, virtually all the time. And so one of the things I'm looking at too is how, back to your third point, in fact, what processes can we embed? What sort of incentives and metrics can we start to use, to leverage this conversation so that people, your 1,000 years reinforced my belief that actually, without forcing us to do it, you're just going to relive the last 1,000. So actually, as you say, we need some policy incentives, we need some metrics, we need belief systems, and to actually make this happen. And you've got some big ideas in your book about that. Just give us some of the sort of big levers that you feel are important.
Well, first of all, Hilary, I think yes, that is a good framing, and it is the right way to sort of set priorities. Let's be realistic. I mean, it's in the case of the UK, more than a 300-year struggle, right? So what came out of the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the sort of the rearrangement of power in Britain was this idea, what became known in the 1700s as the Whig supremacy, which was basically John Locke's interpretation of the legitimacy of power being rooted in property, right? So previously you had the divine right of kings, the king's in charge, tells you what to do. All right, that collapses with the Stuarts. But now what's the basis for legitimacy? Who's in charge? Who gets appointed to run things and so on? That comes from property. And of course, that then becomes, in the 19th century, making money, right? So property was a bit of a static view. Making money is this very dynamic view. And that's where we have the Benthamites saying, let's be more efficient, let's raise national productivity. That becomes the sort of core ideology. And that's why you get pulled back in Britain all the time, Hilary, let's privatize it, right? Because you're being pulled back to, let's make it into private property, because that's going to be better, it's more legitimate, it'll be more efficient. You are being pulled back all the time to the 1720s, even when you don't realize that. But that's a very important point. And I'm not poking fun at anyone, I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying it as I think it is, because if you recognize that you've got that strong pull, you need to have a counter going the other way, right? So what's the counter going the other way? What are your objectives? What's the problem that you're trying to solve? Is it education? Is it healthcare? Is it something else is it homelessness? Is it something else on the social scale? And unless and until you have those metrics, first and foremost, I mean, I don't know what you have, what you hear when you turn on the evening news, but the top thing I hear on the business report of the day is how the stock market is done. Really? Well, look, if you're focused on the stock market, was it up or down today? You know where that's going to lead, right? That's all about profits. That's about the future profits. That's about imagined profits and so on and so forth. Where's your social indicators? Where's the discussion of how we've done in terms of broader impact of any kind? Those metrics are not sufficiently salient. And all of that is up for grabs, Hilary. All of that can be changed, but it's a conversation, and it's a struggle, because you're up against. You have we did have the French Revolution, which laid on top of the Glorious Revolution, right? So we do have this notion of citizenship, we do have this notion of equal rights, but that's not what prevailed in the 19th century. What really substantially prevailed was the Industrial Revolution, with the development of some countervailing powers, as we discussed. So this is one piece, as you say, of a repeated struggle. Every time a new technology pops up, you're going to have this. And I think the answer is the same. You've got to push to solve the problems that are important.
I mean, it's so interesting. And this is obviously an international audience, so we don't want to, talk about too much about the UK, because we're taking away human rights at the moment. We won't go there. But what do you see? What visions do you see in emerging economies or non-Western economies that can give us some inspiration?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, the big worry for those economies is that the cost of running an authoritarian system has come down. Now, if you remember the Arab Spring, Hilary, and the idea that social media would somehow liberate people, make it easier to communicate and undermine dictators, well, that was just over a decade ago, and that's not what happened, right? That's not how the Arab Spring ended. It's not what we're seeing in authoritarian regimes around the world. It turns out that social media can become and has become a tool to control people. And I think the real danger that the AI tech development world is that there's two poles developing, one in the US and one in China. I understand the Europeans, particularly the European Union, may have some influence through its regulation, but they're not driving the development of technology. But if you think about those two poles, I've got my reservations about the American one, but I'm even more concerned about the Chinese one, Hilary, because that's very focused on top-down control, use of pervasive surveillance. Cost of monitoring has come down a lot. That technology will be sold or made available to anybody who wants it and wants to align with China, obviously. And that's a lot of countries. So I think that pulling those societies in that direction, and that direction has a lot of suppression of dissent, suppression of voices, oppression of workers. I think trading with those countries, buying their exports when the labor in those factories is oppressed using this AI technology, I think that's very problematic, Hilary. I think we're going to have to rethink. There are already big human rights issues in the world trading system, obviously, but I think that it's going to become more dramatic and more at odds with what I hope will develop in Western societies, which is AI with safeguards and limits on how much powerful people can exploit the less powerful, because this technology is has massive potential in that direction. I think the US will have safeguards, and I'm sure the Europeans will. But I think emerging markets are going to face some big choices here. I'm very concerned about how that's going to play out.
Yeah, very interesting. I think back to the question of metrics, as you said, I mean, one of the things that always strikes me, we hear about well-being indexes, we hear about the happiness index, there's lots of great ideas about new metrics that will force a different conversation, force different incentives. Do you have any favorites or any examples that you see that give us a little bit of hope in that direction?
Yeah, I think the overall metric discussion has not gone particularly well. I don't think those have gained traction. I think they're a bit too vague for many people. I think focusing on what happens in education is a good one. Education is very concrete. Education is measurable. I think focusing on what happens in healthcare is very important and quite salient, and you can get compelling numbers on that. But I think the key numbers are really wages and the wage distribution and what happens to those middle incomes. To what extent are people in the middle prospering? To what extent are people at the bottom be able to move up? Or is the middle being squeezed? Now you're getting a big dichotomy. So I think that those, we have data on that. We can see that happening. We know that COVID, for example, for all of its terrible evil effects, did help some people at the lower end of the wage distribution move up. So there's been some unraveling of the previous 3 decades of widening of income inequality that came from that COVID effect. Will that be maintained? Is that something that's just a temporary blip? That's a key discussion, but that's a well-informed discussion that's extremely anchored in the work, for example, of my colleague at MIT, David Autor. So I think we don't have the headline number for the evening news, but we do have some metrics that could be that are serious and well documented and could be made more salient.
Interesting. I was intrigued that you weren't a great fan of the universal basic income. And this idea of how do we make jobs and how do we help those people who will inevitably have their jobs replaced. And a lot of people are putting a bit of hope with the universal basic income. So tell us a little bit more about that and what you're thinking is right and wrong with that approach.
I think people want to work, Hilary, not everybody all the time. And obviously people want reasonable jobs and they want decent compensation. But I think with work comes status, with work comes identity. I think universal, if you create a class of people that don't work and receive income irregardless, that's not going to be a politically strong group of people, I would suggest. And I think they will get squeezed over time. And I would be skeptical that those real incomes would keep up. So I think that the political economy and my understanding of human identity suggests to me we're better off if we can create more good jobs, as opposed to saying to people, right, here's a bit of money, don't worry about working.
Interesting. We won't go whether that was their design or not, but I'm interested in this idea of the good jobs, because I look at these jobs, a lot of these jobs, and this is from the perspective of incredible privilege and sitting here in my fancy top bedroom, and but some of these jobs that we're trying to save are blooming awful jobs, and then some of the jobs that we're creating are awful jobs that actually people could do more fulfilling things with their lives than some of the jobs that we're creating. I mean, we won't even go into things like content moderation, but I'm interested in this concept of making good jobs, because what I see is that a lot of the jobs that are just dreadful jobs. And so how do we incentivize the making of good jobs? How do you say what is a good job and not a good job? I think perhaps things like gig economy and employment rights and those type of things obviously have a part. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, this is why we emphasize the need and the opportunity to develop human complementary technology, including using generative AI. And the point there would be that, and I think there's a category of workers that we call craft workers, or modern craft workers, actually. An electrician, a nurse practitioner, a teacher. All of these people could be empowered with technology to do their job better, more effectively, which would exactly what we're talking about in terms of better would obviously depend on the specific context. And that's not what's happening. And I think that that's the key point, which is that you want people to get to be able to do more with their existing skills and to learn new skills through using of technology, and that will lead to higher wages for them. I completely agree that many of the jobs that we're automating were very tough jobs, very tough manual work jobs, for example, leading to breakdown in people's health in their 40s and 50s. It's good to automate those jobs. I also agree that some of the jobs we're creating, like in warehouses, Amazon warehouses are notorious for this, but they're not the only ones. These are really tough jobs, and if you can actually automate more of that work, that could be a good thing. But where are the new tasks you're creating? What are those people going to be doing? How productive are those people going to be? What you really don't want to do is push people out of the warehouses into other low-skilled jobs where they're competing with people who don't have much skill, because that just drives the wages down. So creating new tasks through trying to develop technology deliberately to complement human capabilities and complement all of humans, irrespective of how much formal education they had. I think that's a very legitimate focus and emphasis to have, Hilary.
And I think that really comes back to the first of your 3 points, which is this idea of changing the narrative. Because we sort of I find it myself actually, and we you and I both talk about this is not inevitable. We have to rise up, the citizen, the civil society. And yet, here we are with generative AI. I feel that it's done to me and I haven't got a hope of changing it. But I see also glimmerings, to your point of changing the narrative. You can calling it machine usefulness, humane tech. There's all sorts of little names, responsible innovation, all sorts of things to say, no, we don't want this. We don't want this technology used in this sort of way. And I think a lot of this, the problem with this, and let's just finish on this, because we've both talked about this. I am still surprised, looking at your 1,000 years, that we don't seem to have learned. And I'm, being wheeled out to all these different technological things over there since the 90s, we're making the same mistakes all over again. And I wonder what your view is on why are we, psychologically, systemically, still making the same mistakes all over and over again without expecting a different result?
Well, that's John Locke, the glorious revolution of the Whig supremacy. That's the 1700s. That's the power of this idea of property and then making money as the source of legitimacy and power, right? So that's an anchor in our societies, Hilary, and it did have some benefits, but it's also, a bit of an albatross around the neck now. I think to break from that, I would say, read the history of computer science, which we've got in our book. There's a long-standing tradition of people saying, hey, we can make these computers more useful to more people. However, the way things played out, the way that commercial models developed, the way that Microsoft, for example, scaled up and took over, took us on a different path. All right. So there is plenty of reason, and there are many giants on whose shoulders we can stand to say, hey, let's make things more human complementary. Let's raise productivity of workers. Let's boost their pay. And that was a vision. I would say arguably one of the leading visions of capitalism in the 1920s, for example, in the United States. What we got in the 1980s, based on drawing on the work of Milton Friedman and others, was this very nasty, harsh version. You've got to squeeze the workers. The workers are a cost to be minimized. Drive the workers down. That's not the way capitalism was previously organized after World War II. It's not the visions that we had from the 1920s. It's not the way it has to be. Those are choices. They're powerful choices. They're choices anchored in that 18th century experience. but we can break free from them, Hilary. And you know what? Generative AI is an opportunity to break free, precisely because it is a technology that can be developed by many people in many different directions. Unfortunately, of course, right now, a lot of it is controlled by two big companies. And Daron and I talk to people in and around those companies, very positive, pleasant conversations, but those companies are continuing to press very hard down this squeeze the workers, automate, and create a new task with someone else's problem.
Yes, I was just reading in Wired this morning the interviews with OpenAI about their vision, but it was so techno-centric. It
Right.
really only about that. And people do say, I mean, the reason that we're making such a big fuss about the problems with generative AI, which is clearly a democratizing technology, is that it's the creative jobs, the middle class jobs that are going, rather than those who can be ignored.
Well, that might be what happens. And I agree, that is the path we're on, Hilary. It doesn't have to be that way, because exactly those kinds of creative jobs could be ones in which are made more productive. We could have more of them, but not if you use generative AI to wipe out the job of Hollywood screenwriter, for example. Right? That's a current topic. You could destroy a lot of those jobs right away. Why would you do that? Why are you taking human creativity out of the writing only if you want to drive the costs down? That's a bad mentality. But I agree, it is a very powerful, politically powerful and economically powerful mentality.
Okay, you've got to give us a little bit of hope to finish with, Simon. So
I'm giving you a lot of hope, Hilary. I'm saying it doesn't have to be that way. We choose the path of technology. It's fine to recognize the strong historical weights on our existing path, but we can break free. We did it before, right? From the 1850 to 1950 or 1980. Okay, I understand there was a couple of depressions in there. You've got to get the macroeconomics right. But in terms of the technology development, in terms of the impact on jobs, that was a good century and a bit, right? So we turned away from that, Hilary. We made other choices as a society, or as a set of societies, particularly in the industrial West. We can do a lot better. And this new technology is an opportunity to do that. So I think we should be pushing ourselves to develop more human complementary technologies, where human complementary means complementary to all humans, not just people who have PhDs in engineering.
Yes, and actually, I am the most optimistic person, actually, so I don't know why I got myself in that little gloom moment there. I mean, some others have been on our podcast, Claudia and John, looking at how to change the system, how to involve, how citizens can drive the agenda, how, as you say, with your countervailing powers, how civil society organizations and ordinary people can actually say, no, look, we really have had enough now. It has to be different. And what's great about your book, as you say, it has happened before, it can happen again. So I think, really exciting to talk to you, and really urge everyone to read Simon and Daron's book, because it's both inspiring and really very, very thoughtful about how we got where we are and how we could dig ourselves out of this hole that we're still digging ourselves into, and be a more productive use of technology for the future.
Well, I think you said it very well, Hilary. I appreciate your time, and thanks for all the work that you have done, and thanks for keeping at it.
So fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor Simon Johnson. It's a great honor to have you on the podcast. Really good luck with your work, and really good luck with your book. I think it's going to be a pivotal book, and I'm reading all of the crits as I talk, as I was swatting to come and talk to you, and I can see people really taking on board what you're saying. So all power to you, and good luck in the future.
Thanks very much, Hilary.